So I'd like to thank the three friends of Michael for their insightful comments, and I'd like now to open it up to questions from the audience and/or comments or whatever you want to say.
And I'm going to ask everyone to use this microphone. It's not to project your voice, but for the recording.
Hi, this was a really interesting set of papers. I'm going to ask a question of Andrew and Tamara, which continues a discussion that Tamara and I were having last spring at French Historical Studies about the use of subculture, counterpublic, and the conceptual underpinnings, if you will, of the history of homosexuality or the history of urban culture. What you see as the respective merits of each of those languages, what alternatives you'd like to offer, and the differences between male same-sex sexuality and female same-sex, the asymmetry of gay and lesbian history, if you will. I know that's awfully broad, but...
Because I think some of the difference between the two of us will be chronological, right? The difference between 19th versus 20th century, right? So for me, the value, I'll take both sides of the question. For me, the value in thinking in terms of publics or counterpublics is the recognition that people could recognize evidence of same-sex sexual behavior, participate in it without becoming part of a quote-unquote subculture, right? Because for me, subculture requires, in some sense, it requires an identity that I'm not sure necessarily existed in the 19th century. And so I don't want to assume that because I have evidence of a person who is interacting with men seeking sex with other men, for instance, that they necessarily considered themselves part of a coherent, to a greater or lesser extent, group of people, right? And that public and counterpublic, I think, more accurately engages with that this is a process of recognition and misrecognition on both sides of the equation. As people come across, people either seem different than them or not. And so I take very seriously that there were no homosexuals at the time, right? And so what people did with the recognition that some people were seeking sex with members of the same sex is, I'm not necessarily sure what I can gather from how they felt about them, but I do know that they were part of their public, right? I know that at the very least. Gay and lesbian history, I think for the 19th century it's a difficult one, especially since when it comes to women's desires for other women, at least in the documents, it so often is collapsed into the discourse on prostitution. So especially if we're looking for public lesbianism, that's often where it appears. And knowing precisely what is happening in those milieu is very difficult. So Parent du Châtelet begins this, right? That just like, the fall into homosexuality is a fall. The fall to lesbianism is the final step of the prostitute. So, and there were bans on prostitutes sleeping with other women, in part in order to prevent lesbianism. But one thing I will say, Tamara's is exactly right. If you look at the 19th century and you look at commercial cultures, lesbians are the ones who formed the first gay bars. Like that's the Rapmore and Montmartre, right? They're absolutely first.
And Leslie Choquette has written about that quite wonderfully, actually.
Was that French History a couple of years ago?
She's got a couple of articles on it, yeah.
So eventually, but as she argues, it comes out of prostitution communities, that the managers of these first lesbian bars were former prostitutes. So I actually think there's a lot of work to be done, really either untangling or engaging more fully with the relationship between prostitution and lesbian relations, which I do not do too much in my own work yet. Yeah, that's a great question. Sorry, I went on a little long.
No, that's great. And I'm always so interested in hearing what you have to say because it really informs a lot of my own thinking too. And thanks for that terrific question. I think for me, I would echo a lot of what Andrew has just said. I think that there's a really important distinction between how I use the term a queer counterpublic, because I'm really drawing on Michael Warner's definition of that. And we're differentiating here between a subculture and a counterpublic, especially because a counterpublic is making claims on the public sphere for rights. Subcultures do not necessarily do that. So in his argument, and I'll just reiterate it from my conclusion here, he understands a queer counterpublic as a public, first of all, that's a relation among strangers. Subcultures are not always relations among strangers, that are aware of their subordinate status. That might be similar. That is in tension with a larger public. That might be similar. But that makes possible new forms of gendered and sexual citizenship. And in that, there is this move to a claiming of rights, actually, or of whether that's civil or juridical or whatever. So there's a move that way that I think is important in his work, and it's something that in my own work I'm trying to trace, because one of the things that I see is the beginning of an emergence of a subculture in the 1930s that doesn't get articulated as a counterpublic until really the politicization of lesbian identity, when it is affirmed as lesbian identity in the 1970s. And so we start to see that shift happening across this period, where I'm arguing for kind of a constancy of visibility, but for a real change in sexual subjectivity and identification and politicization that comes out of that. I think yeah, the question of symmetries and asymmetries, it's really interesting in reading Andrew's work on prostitution and the relationship between prostitution and lesbianism, that one of the things that I became very interested in when I was working in the police archives on work that I have that's actually going to come out in French historical studies, hopefully sometime in the not too distant future, on butch-femme relationships in the Sapphic cabarets. And I was looking at police files on the entraîneuses, who are these cross-dressed women who were hired in these cafes. And one of the things that I was coming across that I was really interested in was lesbian prostitution, like among women. Mm-hmm. So women having sex with women and paying for it, which is something that is almost completely absent from the history, that I thought was really interesting. But so I think there's something there. Mm-hmm. I'm going to bypass the question of the differences. There are so many. It's a really big question, but I think I'll just leave it at that and let somebody else have an opportunity to ask us something.
Oh, sorry. And mine's going to go right to Vichy, because you have the Vichy definition of illegal sex is sex with one of the parties is below the age of consent, which is set at 21 for gay sex versus 16, I think, at that time for heterosex.
15,
I think it's 15.
Yeah, and from looking at police records and the cases are all male. That doesn't seem to. I mean, from what I saw, and I certainly didn't do an exhaustive look at all. Does that suggest something about what's seen as threatening or as even, I don't know what it says, but it just struck me when I saw that was, it didn't specify male in the law, but that seemed to be where the repression.
Maybe I could, yeah, no, it didn't. It doesn't
No.
specify male. I would suggest that I think that actually we're in error there. I know that Régis Revenin, who I met through Michael Sibalis, and who has been really helpful to me in my work, and who's done a lot of work on male homosexuality in the 20th century and through that period. When I started working in the police archives, he told me there is no material on women, mm-hmm. on women desiring women in the police archives. It doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. And he was wrong. I mean, I have over 100 files, mm-hmm. And they all are coming out of the Sapphic Cabaret. They're not in the same fichier. They're not in the same dossiers.
Okay.
And I think that part of the problem has been where people are looking.
Right.
And so I have actually found documents. These are not arrest documents, but they tend to be white papers, which is something I referred to yesterday in the John Merriman thing, which are these kind of descriptive analyses of who these women are when the police are trying to figure out whether they're lesbians. And most of the time they think they're lesbians if they dress like men. And if they don't dress like men, then they come up with all sorts of explanations for why they're doing what they're doing, but they're not lesbians. Which is a whole separate issue. But one of the things that I certainly have found is situations where there are situations with minors. And those are, those are there. There are not a lot of them. I haven't found a lot of them yet, but they are there. So I think, I do think that it's less public. And so there's less surveillance, which maybe relates to this notion of surveillance and security, right? So that
I'm
it's
looking
just
in juvenile court stuff, and I'm just not seeing it there. But that's because it's not okay.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So I have a question actually for Howard. I was really struck by this discussion of the police state, security state, and it seems both of you really identified it as a Napoleonic moment. And I was wondering, can we push this idea of surveillance, police state, security state, whatever term we want to use, forward in French history as well? Or is this something that you really identify as being of this particular period?
So let me clarify a little bit. Security state, for me, arose out of trying to examine the trajectory from the early directory or the post-terror period through to the Napoleonic Empire. And liberal authoritarianism became the kind of preferred regime approach to the problems of order after the Fructidor coup d'etat of September 1797. And its product ultimately was the security state. Okay. And that's why I think, because my emphasis was a lot on judicial procedure, a lot of, thousands of cases that I examined of military courts, military commissions, special tribunals, and regular criminal courts around France, led me to believe that there was a certain punctiliousness to judicial procedure, that it wasn't as badly applied as one might imagine if you only looked at police records as Michael did. So having looked at a lot of judicial records, I came to conclude that they were willing to bend the rules and sometimes simply step right over the line when they thought it was necessary. But for the most part, they were worried about that, which is reflected in the senatorial commission, right? Excuse me, I've got this cold going. But the security state that arose from that, I think, is a projection throughout the 19th century that is gradually whittled away at various times and then restored again, let's say the Second Empire, and then whittled away again in the late Third Republic and that sort of thing, right? Because of the tensions that we ended up once again reliving after 9/11, right? That liberal democracy would like to be a lot more punctilious about its application of police power and judicial procedure and that sort of thing. But every now and then there are reasons deemed justifiable to do otherwise, right? And so I think security state applies right into the 21st century, but in ways it's in this tension, this push and pull between liberal democracy and security, right? And police state, I think, is just too wooden to have that flexibility over time, okay? It's sort of applicable to regimes today in Egypt or elsewhere, right? We can still use it. It's not that it's disappeared in the 21st century, but it doesn't capture those tensions and the legitimacy that derives from being able to provide security.
Interesting. Francesca has a question over here. All right. Judy, I don't want to cut you off.
First, I just want to thank you all for your papers, because as one of the original contributors to that volume, I was very moved and saddened by Michael's premature departure, and so I really appreciate this panel in his honor. I just wanted to maybe, if I may, take up what was brought up about the question of sources, and I fully understand the importance for historians to look at things like court records and arrest records. So I'm not by any means trying to minimize that. But I think one of the big issues with trying to trace the presence of women who love other women in same-sex relationships during the period we're talking about loosely, well, the period I worked on was the late 19th century to the early 20th, but let's say just a general period we're talking about here, is that yes, indeed, it is less public. Yes, indeed, it is generally connected, not only in the discourse about it, but in a lot of instances that we can find with prostitution. But maybe there are other sources that deserve to not be completely set aside. And one of the things about the police is that it doesn't always make its way perhaps into the records. It makes its way in another kind of literature, which you might not find worthwhile, but I think it should be taken a look at. And that's the police chief's memoirs, in which they detail enormous amounts of cases of all sorts, which they found to be germane to whatever political points they're trying to make. Usually these police chiefs are very invested in some kind of political position or social statement. And so they pick and choose. The volumes are selective, but there are in those volumes records that are extremely interesting because they show the complexity of working class culture in sort of, how should I put it, sort of lower rungs of the working class, people who are on the margin of being on the really, on the excluded, not exactly prostitution, but sort of marginalized. So that is one place. Another place is records by journalists, which one can look at with a great deal of, I guess, reserve, but they're still very interesting about jails. And there's a lot in that. So those are at least two areas which I think might bear scrutiny if you want to.
I think what's interesting to me, though, is that the juvenile courts are about rescuing to a certain, I mean, they're very punitive as well, but they want to pull young men out of what's going on. And so even though the women are being arrested, they're not being referred to the juvenile courts. It's kind of an interesting thing that...
Because they're treated as adults. And it's a common problem even today. The young woman, the young girl who's arrested as a prostitute is treated like a criminal.
That's true. That's true. If it's prostitution, you're right.
It's
you're right.
It's a very huge problem.
Yeah. You're right.
It's really interesting, Francesca, the point that you're making about reading those police chief memoirs, because I think that one of the things that I found that was just fascinating in the white papers, which were these descriptive interviews with the women that I work on, was the way in which they reflected frequently the morals of the writer. And so they would say something like, despite the fact that she has mauvaise mœurs, okay, all of her neighbors say she's wonderful, even though she comes home drunk at night and makes a lot of noise. And you get these really complicated assessments. They go to the really famous drag balls, right, which they're observing at Magic City and things like that. And they write assessments of the costumes. Right? And this year they had the best costume. And this guy had a light bulb on his head that lit up, and on his right butt it said no exit. On his left butt. I mean, really, it's amazing stuff. And that does give you that kind of a little bit more of those insights, even though you're not getting the voices.
Yeah, that's a constant problem.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Thanks.
Hi, my question is for Tamara. Thank you for a great presentation. You mentioned the cabaret féminin and cabaret artistique, and I'm just interested in the differences between these women, specifically in terms of class, because when one venue was for a bourgeois venue, while the other one was placed in more kind of a working class neighborhood. So I'm just wondering if there were any kind of differences between these women and how they perceive their own identity in terms of how are we become how did they view the term visibility, for example, and also were there any differences in their ethnicity because of the neighborhoods in terms of, I don't know, immigrant women and how they view their own sexuality in ways. So
thank you for that question, Hamza. Yeah, let me start with ethnicity. One of the things that was really fascinating to me about the cabaret féminin, which is these places where these women come together and dance, is that I think thanks to Josephine Baker, one of the things that we see in, and these come from journalistic sources of the time, is a comment that no cabaret féminin was complete without its Negro. And this was a source of commercial attraction. And one of the arguments that I make in my work is that these spaces are also very much commercial spaces, which are producing sexual subjectivities through their commercial interests. But we do see in photographs, in the police archives, in Brassai's work, in other photographs that you can find, we know that these were mixed race spaces, not a lot, but a bit. And Le Monocle, which was the most famous cabaret féminin, those of you who've seen me present on it before, the calling card for Le Monocle is a fascinating card. The image is a woman wearing a banana skirt who is clearly black on a table dancing, being observed by a woman in a suit with a monocle watching her. So it's this kind of colonial appropriation that is racial as well as sexual, and that is repeated in a photograph that I have of the first owner of Le Monocle, director-manager, a woman named Lulu de Montparnasse, and we have an image of her in a suit, a photograph, observing a white woman who is topless, on her knees, wearing a grass skirt. Shimmying, right? So although she's white, it's kind of like a blackface, right? Because of the skirt that she has on and everything that's going on there. So it's a really complicated history. And people like Josephine Baker and others from that period were also, I mean, I think it was a moment where we don't really have lesbianism. And that's also one of my arguments. It's a kind of a much more fluid sexual scene that hasn't hardened or concretized into these oppositions at that time. So in terms of the cabaret artistique, where you see non-white women tend to be as performers, and American jazz performers, Eartha Kitt actually ends up like performing in Fred's Le Carro's Cabaret, and you can also, but you do see them as public as well, and you can see that in photographs too. So that's interesting. It's hard to get at that. I know there's an American who was trying to do work on that at one point, American scholar, and she gave up because she just couldn't find enough sources. So yeah, it's something I would love to be able to do more of. One thing that I do know, which I think is really interesting, is that when these cabarets start to be televised in variety shows in the 1950s, because of Eurovision and a number of the networks, the television networks, they're actually being televised to Algeria as well as other places, and they're on Télé Luxembourg, and so they're being televised across Europe as well as in France, which is really interesting when you start thinking about the fact that when we talk about visibility, one of the issues for a space like a cabaret is that it's a kind of public space in private, right? It's not really on the streets in the way that some of Andrew's work is. But once you take it to television, it's entering people's intimate, private, domestic sphere. And I think that's really fascinating because it's pushing these images of non-normative sexual and gender performance. It's making them accessible, and I argue that actually it's readable. It is readable, both to publics who understand it and to publics who don't understand it, because they can read it as non-normative. They know that there's, as Judith Butler would say, there's gender trouble, and they can see that. So yeah, thank you. It's a great question.
Thank you all for these really interesting presentations. My question's also for Tamara. I'm wondering if you could talk more about what exactly changes in the 1970s, because it seems really almost counterintuitive that we get this narrative of a lack of lesbian spaces as we also have the proliferation of homosexual movements, rights movements in the 70s, and also to just follow up on what you said, also the increased visibility on television of these spaces. So what changes in the 70s to produce this narrative that these spaces don't in fact exist?
Okay. I think that one thing that we're seeing is that the spaces that we see in the 1930s and 40s and moving through into the 50s are not expressly politicized spaces. They're entertainment spaces, they're commercial spaces. And there's a real rejection of that during the politicization of 68 and after. And the young women who come of age and who become part of the feminist movement and then of the MLF and then of the Green Rouge and the whole sort of lesbian radicalism that emerges at that time, which is really in tension with some of this entertainment stuff. Okay, I mean, we have the Kathmandu discotheque, which is owned by Alula Paran, which kind of crosses over a little bit there, but is problematic. The issue of why and how does that come, but the politicization you're asking about, I think it's a function of the larger social and historical context. It's it's all of the things that produce the student revolutions of May 68, the counterculture, the emergence of the homosexual and gay rights movement, which is sort of coming out of this repressive atmosphere of the post-war period, which is really heteronormative. I'm not going to try and define all of that. I do think that the things that are critical to its spread are the use of alternative media. That if we start to see accessibility, the sort of access to different models of sexuality and gender on TV, for example, what you start to see in the 1970s is the emergence of an alternative press. One of my chapters deals with the first lesbian radical magazine, which had letters from 500 women, which I have, an archive of 500 letters that were sent to this tiny little magazine that existed for 2 years from all over the world. So you see people starting to identify through alternative means. I have a chapter on the lesbian Minitel that's looking at the precursor to the internet and the way that this makes it possible for women to start to connect to each other around both issues of identity and issues of political oppression, which is also being supported, of course, very much so by the women's movement, which I think was very much a movement that was invested and filled with and directed by women who were with women, many of them, even though that's not the way that that story is traditionally told. Even the laying of the wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier, I mean, the vast majority of the women who did that were women who were involved with other women. And that's something that we never talk about. That's like the first founding moment of the feminist movement, right? It's not the founding moment of the lesbian rights movement, but that's how we talk about it. So it's a big question, but yeah. Thanks.
Any other questions?
I'm sorry, could I just ask a completely historically oriented question that has nothing to do with the topic, but is about your discussion of security? I was curious in listening to you, how would you think of the Napoleon III's system? Would you put that under a security state or some authoritarian state or something else?
Yeah, it would be a strengthened version of security state. I don't think that that term loses its grip, so to speak, on the nature of the regime. It was obviously more intensive, more bureaucratic, more pervasive because of the development of a more elaborate state, essentially over a couple of generations, right? I think that penal colonies reflected that. I think those are not necessarily definitive of a police state. But they are certainly ways in which most French people of the time felt the society needed to be protected, that this was integral to law and order. And I think the more communities break down, face-to-face village-style communities become replaced by industrial, urban environments, the state and its police become more critical to preserving that order. And so do you start to call that a police state? I mean, I'm a Canadian who's regularly appalled by the extent to which, and not just in the Black Lives Matter context, the police abuse their authority in this country, from my perspective. And yet, it's not even deemed an abuse of authority. It's deemed necessary to maintain law and order, right? By a sort of general consensus, right? The liberal left may protest, and rightly, I certainly feel like protesting regularly, but it's become normative.
I just want to first of all I think this is a great session, and I would hope that Michael would really, really like this session, because he was not my mentor, but of course we met at these meetings, and I met him in Paris, and he was always extremely friendly toward me, always, and asked my opinion about things I knew nothing about. And so I think this panel is a great tribute, in part because I think he so cared about scholarship. And that's what this panel is about. It's not just a panegyric to him, it's about the scholarship and his, all of your interactions with him. And so I think this is just marvelous. I just want to say that first of all. Howard, I also wanted to say, I think your security, from my, I'm social imagination of crime, right? So I'm in the commercial realm here for the most part. But yeah, I mean, one of the things I've had to deal with that I think you're touching upon here is, the ubiquitous invocation of this term sûreté. But actually, it's all over the place. I mean, it kind of really matters. Like, is this a préfecture or a leader of the 2nd Division who is really trying to organize and bureaucratize things, or is this somebody who's just kind of a loose cannon and they just want to go out and kind of do what they're going to do, right? I mean, there's so many fluctuations in all of this, and especially in that, early 19th century, and it goes on. And so I really like your idea about sûreté being a little more,
capacious.
Yeah, and I just think that really is good. And yes, the Pouchet story is entirely fabricated. I affirm that.
I too just enjoyed this panel very much, and I want to say that when I started doing my dissertation research a while ago, all roads led to Michael too, and I've sat, and it was the Paris Police Archives, and I'd have to cycle back to him a number of times because they are so huge, right? And so he would always say, look at that one, look at this one. And he was right. It was exactly what I needed to do. So that was the first thing I wanted to say. And the other thing is kind of a question, I guess it's also for Howard, which is kind of reading backwards, because I actually, most of my work was earlier than Michael's in a lot of ways, but I'm now, for the millionth time, I'm teaching, the French Revolution. And there's been a lot of different turns and twists with trying to evaluate the terror and the historiography of it. And so my students, of course, conflate what's happening in the terror with what's happening in the Napoleonic period, with what happens with, Nazis and Vichy, and, on we go. And so this is oversimplified and probably unfair, but do you have a way of kind of marking the distance, the differences between what's happening in the terror and what is happening in, call it what you want, the police state or not, the security state, because they have a really hard time seeing the difference between those things. Thank you.
It's an interesting question, because I did a piece on what I called Echoes of the Terror, and I laid out the immediate crackdown that followed the Fructidor coup d'etat. They recreated military commissions for émigrés, and anyone caught back in the country could be put to death. And I did a very careful, it took years, analysis of the results of those military commissions and their persecution of priests and that sort of thing. But the numbers are vastly inferior to what they were in 1793-94. The concern for following what was a rather rudimentary law admitted, but nonetheless, most people who went before those military commissions were not executed. It was kind of stunning in its own way, right? And then another wave of repression when the Jacobins had an opportunity in 1799 to sort of save the Directory, so to speak, from invasion and that. And then I call the third one, 1801, the consular terror, because the deportation of over 100 Jacobins and the recreation of special courts, these were called special tribunals. But in every case, the article traced the narrowing of the scope for arbitrariness on the part of officials and police and courts, and more careful legislation to control them. And even though special tribunals were in fact a kind of recreation of the provincial courts of the Ancien Regime, where they combined civilian judges and military judges, they were much less arbitrary than those of the Ancien Regime. So the echoes of the terror are sort of my way of telling students that once they'd had this bloodbath, liberal democracy became very concerned to contain it, even though they had threats to their republic that they had to manage in ways that we would still not particularly approve of. They were continually constraining the arbitrariness and the need to terrorize citizens back into line.